So hey, what's going on? So I'll just kind of get to the point. So in this sort of coronavirus 19 situation that we're all in right now, a special book that had a major impact on my life in the past when I was growing up in my 20s and all that, it came to mind, and it's called White Noise by Don DeLillo. And I recommend this book at least to be read once by a lot of people. It's an example of a postmodern book. So it's a postmodern literature. So you probably have this idea in your head about what is postmodernism, largely because of like YouTube philosophers such as like uh, Jordan B. Peterson, uh, talking about things like cultural Marxism or uh, all this type of stuff. But that's actually not the right way to understand postmodernism, for one. So before I go on, I'm going to read some parts of White Noise by Don DeLillo. This was written in 1985. It was the winner of the National Book Award, one of the most prestigious book awards you can get. Um, Let me see here. It kind of falls in alignment or in the tradition of like authors like Thomas Pynchon, who wrote books such as Gravity's Rainbow, the let me see here, The Crying Lot of 49. And so I'm going to read this parts of this because it's going to really remind you of what's going on with coronavirus for one. But then also I'm going to kind of explain, well, exactly what is postmodernism. Well, technically, if you can explain it according to a true postmodernist or what they would probably say. So before I read that, I just want you to know that this is relevant. This will go into detail about the coronavirus. But the easiest way to understand postmodernism is a circle, right? So this is modernism. This is postmodernism. This is kind of where we're at right now, but we're still kind of lingering debatably in between these two. So postmodernism came after modernism. So let me go here. Modernism represents a solid circle. So this essentially the circle means truth. You can you can understand truth. There's an objective truth, a higher truth, a grand narrative, essentially. Uh, this sort of, you can say, is kind of the result of like the Enlightenment of kind of like the 16th, 17th, 18th century or whatnot, kind of, you know, merging into what would become like, early science and technology. So modernists had this, it's kind of tricky, but modernism as a reaction to what I'm going to say, or I'm sorry, postmodernism as a reaction to modernism was this belief that you could just figure out the truth basically through science, through research, through empiricism. Everything can be understood. We're going to be saved by the monolithic skyscrapers of, technocratic urbanism. For example, you might not have seen the movie, but a lot of people know it just in general pop culture. But the movie Metropolis by Fritz Lang, I believe. Yep. So that's a good example of kind of like modernism, even though that's kind of like a prophetic warning type of a movie. But so when you think modernism, just think empiricism, science, behaviorism. We can understand how people think, tick, in order to solve, rise man up from into this sort of Nietzschean Ubermensch state or whatnot. Uh, but the thing about it, though, is that this circle of modernism, right, it coincided with some very important but very sad events. So we have World War II, and then we have the atomic bomb. So underneath all of that science and futurism and skyscrapers, right, human nature was still under the surface. Old world hates were still persisting. And it culminated in atrocities like World War II and the atomic bomb. So after the war, because of all of that carnage, all of that catastrophe, the Holocaust, Nagasaki, Hiroshima, people began to question this idea. So if grand truths essentially resulted in these two things, then who's to say that this has any validity anymore? So modernism started to crack, almost in a sense. So this is the World War II era. So let's kind of go to this right here. I'm going to put this right there. So in this transition state, right? So let's say the late 40s to the mid to late 50s, right? So we're kind of in, let's just imagine the TV show Mad Men. We're kind of in that era, right? So think about the character of Don Draper. What does he represent? He represents this sort of ubermensch, I do what I want, I will myself to power person, right? On the surface. But we see Don Draper throughout the series of Mad Men constantly having neurotic sort of episodes. He breaks down. He takes on he's living another person's identity. He's an alcoholic. So this era could be called decayed modernism. So how I'm doing this sort of analysis is, as you notice, I'm not really talking about politics like a person like Jordan B. Peterson. And I think it's actually very wrong to talk about politics and postmodernity without explaining postmodernism is really just like an overarching, all-encompassing school of thought. And you can actually be a capitalist postmodernist, or you can be a socialist postmodernist. But ultimately, postmodernity is what comes after modernism, which I'll go into more detail of. So to kind of keep on track here, we have modernism, World War II, atomics, right? Then people's reaction to the atrocities of that, for example. Then we have this sort of intermediary period called decayed modernism, which is what some people in the literary circles would call this sort of era from a literary standpoint, artistic standpoint, etc. So imagine it as a mirror. The mirror is cracking. This is a mirror, now it's cracking. But by, let's just say, the 60s and 70s, we're in full-fledged postmodernism. And postmodernists essentially argue, so let me write this here, postmodern. So we have postmodern here. The postmodernists say there is no truth, or rather, there's no way for us to ever know what the truth is. There's absolutely no way. We're just kind of stabbing in the dark or whatnot. And postmodernism was a direct reaction to modernism. So what they said was, if the higher truths created these two things, just to name a few, for example, I'll even add to this list right here the word eugenics, because this was very popular in the early 20th century, even in the United States with people like the Rockefeller family, Ford, all these people, trying to get rid of unsavory people with disabilities. But regardless, the postmodernists said, if your truths are so grand and they created this, there is no truth. There is none, because it created all of this. There's no way to justify these actions by justifying them with some constructed idea of truth, which is always biased, which is always sort of influenced by the individual subjectivity or whatnot, is always influenced by historicity, is always influenced by even just randomness. So how can you ever say that there's a truth or whatnot? So by the postmodernists having this just say semi-solid circle or no circle at all, what they were able to do was to challenge the underlying assumptions or grand truths that were dictating society. So in a way, it is a very radical frame of thought, which is why conservatives, for example, always point the finger by saying that it's subversive, it's radical, it's for leftists, it's for Marxists. But the funny thing about that whole accusation against postmodernists is that communism didn't create postmodernity. What created postmodernity was a reaction to modernism. Capitalism actually helped to create the postmodern condition or whatnot. It wasn't, radical communists who unilaterally used postmodern techniques for their analysis of understanding power, systems, systemic injustice, things of that nature. Postmodernity essentially could be called, I'm just going to write no truth here, no truth, or it's subjective or subjective. Okay, so no truth or subjective. So I'm already kind of explaining. So postmodernity comes after modernism. It posits that there is no truth in order to usurp the underlying presuppositions of modernism, which resulted in atrocities such as this, which people started to become aware of more so in this intermediary period after World War II. A good movie to watch that kind of captures this sort of sad, pre-nihilistic sort of condition, I would say when it comes to pop culture, to understand it, I would say Mad Men, which is full of all sorts of just, motifs and facts or whatnot. But I would also say a movie called The Master, which has Joaquin Phoenix, and it's directed by, I think it's like Paul Anderson Thomas or something, the guy who directed There Will Be Blood. And these two kind of represent the post-war man, essentially, in his sort of anguish and his despair or whatnot, as a reaction to the cracking of this solid mirror that resulted because of this. So, but to go back to how postmodernity is actually created by capitalism, essentially, right? First off, it only has one directive, which is to make profit, right? So think of it as like an animal. It only wants to eat, and it wants to figure out new ways of eating. Or you can say it wants to figure out new ways of efficiently killing something to kill its prey in order to maximize its own profit or whatnot. That is the underlying anima of a capitalist organization or whatnot. So capitalism, even though it does great things for us, competition, quote unquote free markets, which don't really exist, by the way, just innovation comes from this. But what happens when a society reaches its apex, when efficiencies are achieved so well that the machine itself replicates itself and it can't distinguish between the real and the false? That's postmodernity. So, for example, right, think of, everybody knows Andy Warhol. Why was he making just random art of Campbell soup cans or making, Xerox copies of Marilyn Monroe faces? He was being ironic, but he was being ironic to the fact that this was the zenith of capitalism. Capitalism essentially advances itself so much while expanding things like bureaucracy. Actually, it's not the government, actually. You can say that bureaucracy exists internally to, let's just say, a corporate structure. Any company that wants to survive, right, wants to get bigger, right? So you go from a small business, oh wow, that small business is doing good, IPO, now you're public, now you're a corporation. Now instead of just one office, you have various departments, compartmentalized. It's like an ant colony, right? That is capitalism for you. It's very similar in its anima to that of what we would consider totalitarian communism, but that's a matter of dialectics, which will come later. But the thing is that when capitalism, like I said, it creates a simulation of itself once it gets so advanced that its truth in itself becomes indistinguishable. There is no truth. The truth might be what this TV station says, that TV station says, but this TV station has X profit incentive. This TV station has Y profit incentive. So what is the actual truth or what not? But what's dictating both of them? The quest for profits, constant profits, market share, or whatnot. So, for example, to think about postmodernity in terms of capitalism, one of the best ways actually to do it is first you can go to literature, like high literature, stuff like White Noise, which I'm going to talk about, but you could also go to science fiction. In science fiction, right, so this is a hard hitter. Everybody knows Philip K. Dick, so he wrote Do Androids Dream Electric Sheep, which inspired Blade Runner. He wrote Ubik, which is probably arguably one of the best existential science fiction books ever written. I think it's on like the New York Times best 100 books or something of the 20th century. The Man in the High Castle, everybody, so Amazon, the series. So the one way to understand capitalism in its context to postmodernity is actually science fiction, particularly golden era science fiction. So for example, let's take a look at this cover. So first off, you see these abstract colors, right? You know, these monochromatic, just in your face colors. But you also see this sort of digital simulation of, let's just say, a Greek statue, right? So that's a very profound image, even though you wouldn't consider it so just by looking at it at a glance. So you have a statue, let's just say that represents logos of the West, truth, but it's in a simulation form. So which one is true and which one is not? You know what I'm saying? Did the ideology that this statue encapsulates create its own digital sarcophagus in a sense? Or whatnot, or is this just a random copy of another copy? Who knows? But this is actually a really good text about postmodernity, and it's a good example of postmodernity because philosophy aside, when it comes to the typical motifs in literature of postmodernism, this story is an alternative history, and it features a common trope in postmodernism of a story within a story. So one thing you'll notice about postmodern film, books, movies is that it has an asymmetric storyline. So it's bleeding back and forth between time. So it has an irregular plot structure. It breaks the original idea of, the first act, was it like the climax, and then it's like the first act, you have a bunch of action in between, and then you have the finale or the climax or whatever. A postmodern story you might start off with the climax, go back to the beginning, go back to the climax, jump here, jump there. So it sort of distorts your perception to challenge your underlying perceptions of what is actually a solid reality. Another thing about postmodern books, films, etc., is that what was I going to say here? You typically have characters that break the fourth wall. So, for example, you'll have a character who will let's just say, be within their own storyline, but then all of a sudden they'll turn to you and start talking to you. Like they're hyper aware that they're in a story that you're reading. Like it's extra dimensional almost. Another sort of trope of postmodern literature is typically actually references to pop culture, which is very, very important. For example, Quentin Tarantino movies, right? Think about Pulp Fiction. That is an exemplary postmodern movie, right? So you have all the characters with different storylines, all intertangled with each other in an irregular plot structure, i.e., like, for example, did Uma Thurman go on her heroin overdose here or over there? Who knows? But you also have characters who almost inhabit a soundstage. Like, for example, when the famous scene where John Travolta and Uma Thurman are dancing, right? You notice is in this a very Americana pop culture restaurant, and everybody is decked out like Buddy Holly, Marilyn Monroe, Shirley Temple, or whatnot. So we're watching a fictional movie with people acting like fictional characters. Um, that's another sort of common thing of postmodern like films or whatnot. Another thing about postmodern films, books, and literature that you'll notice is a penchant for fetishism and shock value, or you can even say digressive fiction. So, for example, books like I always butcher his name, Chuck Palahniuk or Palahniuk, the guy who wrote Fight Club, very digressive. American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis, very digressive. And the interesting thing is that American Psycho is a good example of a postmodern book because you have this character who is taking on a different identity, and he's constantly obsessed with capitalist material items and wealth and bullshit. And so Bret Easton Ellis, in my opinion, wrote that book, which is Postmodern, in order to actually critique postmodern capitalism, of when people reach this state of beyondness. They are so far removed from their real nature in this sort of manufactured shopping mall existence that they start to actually revert to their animal side to feel something. And in the case of Patrick Bateman, it's the most extreme version of it. So, like, he's been reduced to an animal because of the advancements and the humanization of, let's just say, a post-capitalist society. Um, so it's just very interesting, but regardless, back to this: modernism, truth; postmodernism, no truth. And this was a direct reaction to this. So let's just call this conservatism. Even though you have conservative postmodernists, contrary to popular belief. But let's just call this like ontological conservatism. Like, like there is a God, there is a firm right or wrong. Postmodernism came around to challenge that fact, because you can say that it's right to let's just nuclear bomb a city of 5 million people. That's right. I mean, that's ethical, right? That's utilitarian. But the postmodernists would say, no, it's not utilitarian. You just came up with that. That's just your idea of what is ethical and what is utilitarian or whatnot. So now that postmodernism, which was, you can arguably say that, for example, I was born in the mid to late 80s. So I was born under, let's just say, postmodernism. And postmodernism still exists, by the way. You see it every single day, particularly in humor. So, for example, without postmodernism, you wouldn't have The Simpsons or South Park. You especially wouldn't have probably the most postmodernist show ever, Seinfeld, which is what? A show about nothing. A show about people who live in an advanced post-capitalist society who are essentially, like, you can almost say they're like the superior people of their society, even though they don't even realize it, who are left to their own devices in a totally random, chaotic, nihilistic Einstein universe, who get into random adventures for our own entertainment. Just weird shit. Talk like, just like her hands are too big or something. She has man hands, or like just all sorts of different things. But Seinfeld is a good example of postmodernity. And the reason why I bring up The Simpsons and Seinfeld is because it is my belief that these two TV series, in a way, owe a debt to this book. Because this is probably the first book I ever laughed out loud to. because it was so bluntly dark, but at the same time joyously philosophical in a very easy to grasp coffee table read way, that I recommend it. Like, once you read it, The Office will make sense. Even more than it already makes sense. It just won't be funny. Like, the philosophy behind it will be funny. Seinfeld, Simpsons, everything. But this circle right here, right? This is kind of where we are right now. Even though postmodernity still kind of lingers, it is such a powerful cultural aesthetic. It turned itself into an aesthetic, even though it posited that there was no truth. Like, people became to believe in it so much that it became a truth and a way of life through culture, style, fashion, that it became a fixed truth in itself. But when you're taught, even though, let's just say, the postmodernists had noble intentions of criticizing modernism for what it had did, the thing about postmodernity is it is nihilistic. It totally leads to nihilism. So you go around saying, oh, there is no order, fuck that, fuck authority, fuck this, fuck that, part of my language. But just being real, you eventually deal with nihilism at one point or another. It doesn't matter whether it's in the cultural sphere, your personal sphere, the technological sphere. If everything is just chaotic, random acts of violence, acts of catastrophe, acts of love, acts of heartbreak, or whatever, you eventually enter a nihilistic epoch. And it's arguably said that the late 20th century onward was the nihilist epoch. Just because we're laughing doesn't mean that we're not nihilist, or we don't have nihilistic tendencies or whatnot. Just look what people are into, People will just watch, like, people getting into car accidents, or, people laughing when they fall or whatnot. This is entertainment. That in itself is just postmodern. It's so ironic. Irony is a big thing with postmodernism. And what's interesting is that nihilism and irony and challenging authority, let's just put a little anarchy in the mix here. Totally spelled that wrong, but anarchy, let's just put the word punk here. So in a way, postmodernity sort of harkens back to what Nietzsche was saying when God, I'll put a lowercase g, not to offend anybody, God is dead. No authority. There is no authority. All of these ideas, in a way, who was born under this? Generation X. And to an extent, on the border, millennials, at least older ones. So this came to define, let's just say, the late 60s to arguably mid 90s, even though it had a lasting effect which exists to this day. But as it came to, let's just say, a conclusion, right, there was a new movement called metamodernism. And it's actually still a little new. It's still not really respected by the older postmodernists. But the thing about them, though, is they try to reconcile both of these positions. They realize that there is a truth, but it might be more of a sort of collective idea. Or rather, it's like, I know that there's a truth, but I'm going to be a little suspicious as I approach it. Whereas the postmodernist all out refutes it, and the modernist all out claims to know everything. They're kind of a little iffy. Like, there's a truth, yeah, like up is down, whatever, gravity exists and all this type of stuff. But when it comes to a little more complex questions or whatnot, they're a little more open-minded to hear your opinion, to hear it through. They're more about correlation of various subjective truths in order to create a solid, safe truth, essentially, So they merge postmodernism with modernism. So a lot of people, when you hear the term metamodernist, there is a sense of reconciliation. Reconciliation. So there's a sense of that, right? So the thing about metamodernists, right, is that you can also put the word sincerity. There's a yearning to be sincere, to have reconciliation. So they have metamodernists, which are arguably, let's just say, millennials and in Gen Z or Y. I forget which one we're on now. That's the thing you notice about our generation or younger, is that we're very fact driven. We'll watch that documentary. We'll go into the weeds of it. We'll hear this opinion, hear that opinion. But at the same time, there's, I think, more of, this is why progressivism actually, I think, has more of a sway than than the resurgence of far right conservatism. Because I think down is that people just know history. They can access history so much more, in a way where they can actually say that, yeah, the past had a lot of cool things to it, but we also had this, too. But at the same time, I don't want to live my life living a nihilistic existence full of irony. I mean, I'm a little nihilistic. I'm a little ironic, My fashion might be a little punk or whatnot. Sure, I might be an agnostic or whatnot, but to a certain extent, I still put faith that there is a higher truth, that there is some sort of overarching higher thing which binds mankind's thought process. There is a truth out there. I'm just going to be a little cautious as I approach it. So the circle vacillates. It oscillates. Solid circle, no circle, oscillation. It's there, but it's a little faint or whatnot. So the thing about metamodernist art is that you'll notice is that it uses postmodern tactics, such as it will merge things. So, like, for example, in merge high art with low art. So, for example, to a modernist or something, or let's just say even like classical era people or whatnot, there was a firm idea of what was art. It was symmetrical. It was, a chiseled sculpture of a man. It was almost, you can say that it was man's attempt at finding a higher truth in an era where they had no control over nature. So perfection through the idea of like a God, through God, for example, who created mankind, was a way of art form. There is a true beauty in everything like that. But the thing for a postmodernist is, instead of having Rembrandt art here, you might have Rembrandt in a comic book. You might have Campbell soup cans as high art or whatnot. And some postmodernists took it to the extreme.